This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. If you're hearing this sentence and understanding it, you can thank the 3-pound organ that resides between your ears. And if you've ever written a book, an email, or even a to-do list, it all starts with 100 billion neurons within your brain. But here's the big question. How do our brains think? Our opinions, ideas, thoughts, and feelings are unique to each of us. This hour, we'll be looking into how this all works with the people behind the Yale Peabody Museum's new exhibit called Mind Over Matter, the Neuroscience of Perception, Attention, and Memory. Joining us now is Colón Ramos. He's the curator of this exhibit and also a professor of neuroscience and cell biology at Yale University and associate director of the Tsai Institute. Good morning, Danielle. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning, Catherine. Thanks for having me in the show.
And for our listeners, if you have any brain questions, give us a call. We would love to hear from you, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Danielle, we're so excited for this conversation. So many questions about the brain. But before we dive into the exhibit, I kind of want to start with your background. What drew you to neuroscience in the first place?
Well, I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, and I was surrounded by tropical scenes and animals there. And one of the early memories that I have of becoming interested in neuroscience was a trip that I once did to the beach, and there were these baby sea turtles that were hatching from a nest, and they were beelining it towards the ocean. And I remember thinking as a child, how is it that these animals that have just dug their way out from the sand, they have never been to turtle school, how is it that they know exactly where to go? And the other thing that really fascinated me was that as I was thinking that, there was a guide explaining, we were there in a service trip, and there was a guide explaining that those animals were going to live decades in the ocean. They were going to travel all over the Atlantic, go to Africa, Europe, South America, North America. And when they had to make the most important decision in their lives, which is for a turtle, is where it's going to lay its eggs, it was going to find its way back to that exact same place. And it just blew my mind. And I was like, well, how does this work? How does memory work? How does cognition work?
Well, you had me at turtle school. And it makes so much sense to me that your mind would be blown because now you're in this neural world. And it sounds like you were really drawn to the natural world, sort of wondering how these creatures exist. So I imagine it's the observing that really kicked this off, right?
That's right. And it was also realizing that, those concepts like what we call memory, they're shared with the animal kingdom. So animals do have memory. So we share with the rest of nature faculties that are intimately part of our human experience, but they're also, because we're a product of evolution, they're part of our evolutionary history. They're present in other organisms. And the other thing is that even something that is so familiar, like a memory, actually, it has a lot of texture. Like there are different types of memories. Like in the case of the turtles, for example, there's that almost ancestral memory that they inherit in their ability to know that they have to go to the ocean when they're born. It's an instinct. But also there's this plastic memory, this more experiential memory of remembering that beach at which they were born, which depends in the context of which the animal was born. And that's something that is relatable for us as humans too. Like we don't like to think about human instinctual behaviors because we like to focus more on, our individuality and what makes us different. But our capacity to speak, our capacity to have language, to use language, is a shared human instinct. What language we use depends on our context.
Well, the idea of ancestral memory is so fascinating to me because we all have different instincts, but a lot of those instincts are also very universal. And I think what's amazing about neuroscience is, having this conversation and with what you just said, there is still so much we don't know about the brain. And we shared this earlier, and you shared this with us, that there are 100 billion neurons in the brain. And that's very similar to how many stars we have in the galaxy. So tell us about that thought process.
Yes, I like to use the the Milky Way as almost like an analogy of the vastness of the brain. Because on one hand, the brain is only about 3 pounds. It fits between our 2 ears, as you mentioned at the beginning of the program. On the other hand, there are 100 billion neurons in a healthy brain. That is equivalent to how many stars there are in the Milky Way. So I tell students, when you're sitting outside in a clear night, looking at the Milky Way and just musing about the infinity of possibilities out there in that galaxy, think also that that's a reflection of the possibilities of a human brain, and also of the mysteries. Like I like to remind students, and this is one of the things that when we talk about the exhibit, we can speak more about. We like to, in the exhibit and in my classes, I like to end every fact with a question, because in science, like I think in classes, people are used to every question ends with an answer. But in science, every answer ends with a question because you're trying to learn more about it.
Right.
And the human brain is a field that actually, and brains in general, the nervous system, neuroscience, is a field that lends itself to that because there's so many unanswered questions. And one of the things that I like to muse about is maybe some of these visitors that are going through, maybe some of the young ones will be the ones that will answer some of these questions and lead to more interesting and deeper questions.
So how do the students react when they have this image of their brain being a galaxy? I think there's something very romantic about it, and obviously my brain is doing things as I'm processing this information, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do they share with you when they realize how vast our brains are, and the fact that there are so many unanswered questions, which I think it's scary for a lot of people, but I also
Mm-hmm.
find that to
Mm-hmm.
be very hopeful because there's so much more we can learn.
Yes, I tell people that in science in general, this is true for all sciences, I will argue, knowledge is almost like the trailhead to the process of discovery. There's always another layer that you can go deeper. Like you can look at the 3 pounds of tissue, and we do this in the exhibit. We start with the 3 pounds of tissue, which is the brain, and then you go deeper and you start seeing that there are actually circuits in the tissues, and then you go deeper and you actually see their cells, and then you go deeper and you see their organelles, and then you go deeper and you see that they're macromolecules, and so on and so forth until you end up in physics and chemistry, and everything is connected. And it is for students that are transitioning into the sciences, it is both like a sense of wonder, like they're like, oh my God, it's far more fun to be thinking through these questions as a scientist, I would say, than it is sitting in a classroom being like told what the answers are.
Mm.
So all these scientists that the students are listening, hearing about in their classes, where they condense 300 years of human knowledge into 45 minutes, it warps the experience of creation, of thinking, of questioning, which is something that we try to recreate in the actual exhibit. And I have one of the things that I have done since the exhibit had opened is just go in and sit back, and no one knows who I am, and I'm just kind of listening to how people experience the museum, and they experience it in different ways, and it's wonderful to see how they navigate that, like children and adults of all ages. But also you see, as they are wrestling with these concepts, many which they had never thought about before, you can see their eyes open like really wide, and their minds blown and by by some of these things. And that's the purpose of that exhibit, and that's wonderful to see. And it does, it's like any thrilling experience, it's very emotional. So yeah, so there are emotions of both wonder, but also emotions of like, oh my God, what do you mean we don't understand this, or
Mm.
fear, or reframing of what you thought people knew, and now you're realizing, oh, as humans, actually, we have learned a lot about the brain, but there's still a lot of exciting questions left.
Well, I think it's really wonderful that people can experience that through an exhibit. And you mentioned that everyone has a different experience with it, and the exhibit actually starts with sharing the story of the two founding scientists of neuroscience. Can you share that story with our listeners?
Yes, absolutely. So this is a really fascinating story in it to me, because first it represents the discovery of some of the most fundamental principles of how our brain works. And second, it's a very kind of like meta story, because in a way, these scientists, that's all scientists do actually, they were using their brains to study the brain.
Mm.
So their brains are also susceptible to biases, to what we call priors, which are frameworks or concepts of how we think things should work that we use to make sense of our world. We all do this, and in the exhibit we have whole sections about this. And these two scientists were the first ones to be able to like stain tissues of the brain and then look at the subset, like at the components that make up the brain. In their case, at that time, it wasn't known if the brain was built out of cells or not. And knowing if the brain is built out of cells or not, today it sounds like a pretty simple question, but it was actually a fundamental principle. This actually governs all of our understanding of every disease that you have heard of that is related to the brain, every faculty, every cognitive faculty that humans have, etc. Like these are deep building blocks. And the scientists were looking at it, and one of them, as they were looking at the same type of data, the same type of stains, one of them looked at it and had one interpretation, and the other one had a different interpretation. One of them actually saw cells, and the other one, when he looked at the same data, said, no, these are not cells. This is just like connective tissue, like the way that you will have like cables connecting to cables all over, and they're not separate entities. And we use that to discuss a human faculty called perception, which is the fact that you and I sense our physical world by looking at it or listening to it, and we think that we are all interpreting reality the same way because we're all looking at the same things. But there's a difference between, actually we had in the English language we use different words for it. There's a difference between looking and seeing, or hearing and listening. And the reason for that is because what we pay attention to, what our background is, what our priors are, kind of shapes our sense of what we're seeing. And in the museum, we go at great lengths with visual illusions to, once we tell this story about how these two scientists made these fundamental discoveries in neuroscience, to have people experience how their brains might think that they're seeing one thing, but they're actually seeing a different thing. And we can actually, I can describe it. There's a lot of like mind-bending visual illusions that will be interesting to describe by radio, see how well we can do. But the concept being that we're trying to get people outside of their heads to reconsider what is it that they're seeing, and understand the difference between like looking and seeing, perceiving.
Well, I think there's some mind-boggling situations happening right now, at least for me and my brain, just listening to you describe a little bit of the history and what to expect if you haven't gone to see the exhibit yet. But I think one of the things that, I don't know if it surprised me, but did it surprise you in terms of knowing that these two neuroscientists that launched this field of science actually disagreed so much, and yet they shared a Nobel Prize together? And I know
they did. Yeah, they did. And actually one of the special things that we do in that part of the exhibit, and this is of great value to these science aficionados out there, like I encourage them to visit the exhibit, because for the next 3 months, the exhibit has, for the first time to our knowledge in like human history, the drawings of these two scientists side by side. So not only did they not see eye to eye, but one of them was from Italy, the other one was from Spain, and their drawings had never been shown, like the original drawings, side by side, because they disagree so vehemently with each other, and they had not been the opportunity. And so we work closely in the Peabody staff work closely with the curators of these drawings, which are in and of themselves, like the drawings are like priceless pieces of art, of scientific history, and also these kind of, it shows you how the scientists were thinking through these questions. And we work closely with the curators to be able to bring original drawings that had never been exhibited before. So I think that people that are into history of science, or art aficionados, or want to understand how art links actually to reframing of concepts and science, etc., I think they'll really enjoy that part. I wasn't, as a scientist, I wasn't surprised that there was disagreement, because one of the things that I have learned about science is that it's in the disagreements that you, like putting forward your ideas and then trying to understand the perspective of the other scientists that have spent a lot of time also thinking through it, that you actually achieve greater understanding of what you're seeing. And that's something that we try to communicate in the exhibit. So a simplistic way of telling the story of these two scientists will be like, oh, they disagreed and this scientist was right and the scientist was wrong, and that will leave you with the impression that one of them was sloppy and the other one was actually careful, or one was, then, like I think that doesn't quite capture the very important relationship that these two scientists had in pushing the boundaries of our understanding forward. And the scientist that thought that was wrong, which was the Italian scientist Camillo Golgi, many of the people in the radio might recognize from their biology classes the word Golgi, because he was also the discoverer of the Golgi apparatus, which is a very important organelle inside cells. And that, so these were towering figures that in being wrong helped, the same way that you need shadows and light to be able to see contrast, you need different perspectives to be able to really understand what you're looking at. And when you're looking at the unknown, you need to have these conversations openly and be able to disagree, and be able to like refine them as you find more information.
Well, and then building on exactly what you just said, this exhibit was also premiered during the election season and during a time where we're seeing such a divide in our country in many different ways. And you're asking people to challenge their perceptions and reality. And with, I mean, the perfect storm of a story of two scientists who disagreed, but found maybe success is not the word, but found this amazing discovery from that through this sort of disagreeing process. And that's a really hard barrier, I think, for many people to go through. So what do you hope to tell people who go through the exhibit and have it in their minds that, this is actually sort of a product from disagreement in some way?
I think one of the things that we do in the exhibit has a little bit of something for everyone. So it has, for example, mind-bending illusions, it has magic tricks, it has videos of scientists explaining their research. So I have seen, 6-year-olds go through the exhibit and just like have their mind blown by the illusions, and their explanations of how the illusions work. And they, maybe they spend less time trying to understand why the illusion works that way. But I have seen adults looking at the same illusion and also being like, oh my God, how does this work? And then reading about it and understanding the neuroscience. So there are different ways of experiencing the exhibit. One way of experiencing the exhibit along the lines of what you described, that which we try to achieve in the way that we order things, is that there is, as you leave the Kahala and Golgi section, which we were just talking about, there is what looks like a mask that, as you move around the room, is following you with its gaze. And people are like really bothered by it because they're like, why? People think it's a hologram. It looks a little bit like a hologram. And it's a mask of Albert Einstein. And people are like, they're walking around there and trying to make sense of it. And it doesn't make any sense to them. It's a visual illusion that doesn't make sense. And I'll start by saying that it's not even a mask. Okay. So it's actually a concave object. And our brain builds the illusion of a mask. And the reason that people get the perception that is following you is because our brain is constantly updating like the illusion in a way that it looks like it's looking at you. Because you're trying to make sense of an object that is ambiguous and is constantly looking at you. And what I tell people when I give tours of the exhibit is that I say, look, if you were to stand 3 feet away from this mask, facing it, and I try to convince you that this is not a mask, I wouldn't be able to. It's impossible for somebody looking at it to abandon the perspective that it's a mask. Even when they have gone behind it and understood that it's actually a hollow object, it's not a mask. It's that the mask is completely an illusion in their brains. They cannot see the hollow object when they stand in front of it. And I tell them, this is a simple object. It's almost like a 2-dimensional object that is incredibly simple. You can hold in your hand, you can turn around, you know what you're looking at, you rationally know what you're looking at, and it's confusing. Imagine really confusing abstract concepts that are in society. And I tell them, the other thing that I like to share is the same way that you have to kind of move around the object and look at it from different perspectives, look at it from behind, like gather more information. In general, the more confusing something is, the more disagreement there is, the better we are gathering different information about it, gathering different perspectives as we are forming our opinions about it. And I'm not saying that all opinions are equally valid. I'm not saying that there's some people, like if you need a heart surgery, you don't go and get 500 opinions from different people that know nothing about heart surgery. You go to an expert. So there are opinions that are more valid than others based on the preparation and the time that people have put into their opinions. But I am saying that the more perspectives one gets about a given ambiguous situation, the better off one is in trying to find how that works. And that's essentially how science works. That is also the story at the beginning of the exhibit on how these fundamental principles of neuroscience emerged.
Well, and as you're speaking, I was just imagining, well, as human beings, we do like to complicate simple things. So there must be more. It cannot be that simple. And well, I can't wait to experience it myself. You are all listening to Danielle Colón Ramos, who's the professor of neuroscience at Yale University, and he also curated the new exhibit at the Yale Peabody Museum called Mind Over Matter: The Neuroscience of Perception, Attention, and Memory. Coming up next, we will hear from the director of the Yale Peabody Museum on how this exhibit came together and also the process of connecting neuroscience to the natural world. You can join the conversation. Let us know if you have any questions, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. If you can believe it, scientists are still working to understand the brain. That's according to the National Science Foundation. The brain, and how early neuroscientists interpreted it, is the subject of a new exhibit at the Yale Peabody Museum called Mind Over Matter: The Neuroscience of Perception, Attention, and Memory. With us still is Danielle Colón Ramos, who's a professor of neuroscience at Yale, and he also helped curate this exhibit. And joining us now is David Scully. He's the director of the Peabody Museum. Thanks so much for joining us, David.
Thank you for having me.
So I watched you nod a bunch as Danielle was sharing his story about the exhibit. Respond to what you've heard, anything that jumped out to you.
Oh, I love listening to Danielle talk about this stuff. I learn things every time we speak, and that's been really the fun and just the real joy in putting this together. This exhibit goes back, the development of it goes back, several years, and so we've had many conversations. And that's the wonderful thing about working with really great scientists like Danielle is and helping them tell the stories that are sitting in their brains.
And so I think for many people, when we're thinking about the Yale Peabody Museum, we often see it as a museum of the natural world and the natural sciences. And this exhibit is specifically about neuroscience. Can you tell us more about how it came together?
Sure. There's two pieces to it. As many of your listeners will know, the museum reopened last March. And that was in many ways a rethinking of what a museum like this could be. When we closed the museum, it was the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History. When we reopened it, it's the Yale Peabody Museum, not because we don't care about natural history. I'm a natural historian. I'm a scientist who focuses on that. But that there is more that we actually have offered in the past and that we want to continue to emphasize. And as we were considering that future, and I'm going back 7 or 8 years, I knew that we wanted to open our temporary exhibit program with something that would be a little less expected for the museum. And right at that time, Danielle and I had both been asked by the leadership of Yale to be part of a committee called the University Science Strategy Committee to think about the future of science at Yale. And there were like 12 or 14 people on this committee from all over the university. And I believe Danielle and I had met before, but we didn't know each other very well. But we ended up spending over a year and many meetings together. And in the interstices of those meetings, we were able to have conversations about our interests and some of the things that we shared. And one of the ideas that came out of that was that it would be great for the Peabody to be able to tell the stories of the wonderful neuroscience that was going on at Yale. I mean, the institute that Danielle belongs to, in some ways, is a product of the deliberations that happened in that committee, and it was really tapping into Danielle and his extremely talented colleagues who are just world leaders in this field, and giving them more resources and a better platform to do their work. And the Peabody is another way that Danielle and his colleagues can share what they do with different audiences in different ways. And Danielle really appreciated that opportunity. And we really appreciate the chance to take what we know how to do really well, which is telling stories about science and the natural world and connecting with people who have the content expertise like Danielle.
Well, and one of my favorite things about having conversations like these, especially with all of the museums around Connecticut, in which we have so many, and it's really exciting that we have this resource, is to be able to go deeper and share how these exhibits are put together. I mean, I think a lot of people know the Peabody for the dinosaur exhibits. It's so popular. Kids love it. Adults love it. So, how was putting this together different from other exhibits you've had in the past? And because we're on radio, like Danielle mentioned earlier, can you sort of give us an idea, like paint us a picture of what the exhibit is like?
Yeah, and I may lean on Danielle to jump in on some of this.
Sure.
But I think you hit it on the head. Like we know a lot about paleontology. We know about dinosaurs. I'm a vertebrate scientist. I work on amphibians. I know a lot about that. Um, our understanding of fields like neuroscience is very arm's length. Yeah, I'm
Mm.
a scientist, and I read the what comes out in Science and Nature magazine and so on, and I talk to my friends like Danielle and hear what they're doing. But I couldn't have put this together, and really no one in the museum could have. So to do this right, we have to partner, and I think what this has opened our eyes to is how rewarding that can be. Also, in many ways, challenging because Danielle and his colleagues had to learn this process of putting an exhibit together. And maybe I'll pause there and let Danielle talk about that from his perspective. But he leaned way into it. But as he can tell you, there's lots to think about when you're turning something that you know really well into something that people can consume, let alone just the process of developing an exhibit.
Well, and it sounds like both of you and your teams had to do some mind bending yourself, which is kind of
Yeah.
perfect for this conversation. I had to throw that in there. So, Danielle, let's just share your experience.
Sure. And I like to say that and we talk about different perceptions and abilities of animals in the exhibit to do handshakes with the museum and refer to things that the museum has going on. And I like to say two things that come to mind. One of them is that when you look at animals, you realize that it's easier to see it in animals that their brains have evolved to solve very specific problems. So a bat brain, for example, is endows the bat the ability to navigate dark environments. So what has the human brain evolved to do? And the human brain is really, really good at connecting with other human brains. So I will extend what David just said and say that I wouldn't have been able to put this exhibit on my own either. So this is actually a collaboration with over half a dozen different scientists from across campus, all of them belonging to the Tsai Institute, which is this new institute that David was referring to. And my lab actually works on the very fundamental building blocks of the brain and how these cells that form part of the brain connect to each other. So in order, for example, to derive these sections of the emergent properties of what the brain does, like perception and memory and attention, we worked with people that do research in psychology, in human behaviors, and we drew from researchers that have been teaching at Yale. So a lot of the materials are actually taught in Yale classes to Yale undergrads or are part of cutting edge research. We have a section also on AI, in which we collaborated with data scientists. So this was the story that this was a collaboration, and the story that we tell of Cajal and Golgi is very much emblematic to how both the exhibit was done, how we think about the human brain, and how we think about collaborations in science.
And David, Danielle mentioned AI. It's a small part of this exhibit, but AI and concerns about it are top of mind for many people, especially today. So, how have you included it in the exhibit?
Yeah, so the idea of including AI came up pretty early. I believe Danielle was the one who brought it up, and everybody immediately latched onto it as a great idea and as a good way to kind of put a coda on the exhibit. You know, you've been thinking about how humans and other living organisms deal with these challenges of attention, memory, and perception, then we're all reading every day in the news and hearing about what AI is up to next, and it can be very ominous. And Danielle does a really great job of positioning this that it can be threatening to people to have these artificial entities that have properties that are so like our own, but perhaps have capacities beyond our own. That it gets at what is a human? We're, as Danielle just said, humans are characterized by brains that are really pretty uniquely geared towards interacting with other brains. When you start throwing these sort of artificial brains into the mix, that can be unsettling the same way that the Albert Einstein mask is unsettling. We're seeing something that we think we understand, but it's somehow different. It's a cognitive version of visual illusion, right? And we're still, I think, as a society, getting our heads around what that means in a way that, for other sorts of machines we've dealt with long ago. So what we're doing with AI in the exhibit, it's really just along one part of the exhibit right before you leave the exhibition, is to leave people with some thoughts about what AI really is and what it represents, that we can kind of carry into our lives. And something that I don't think has come up quite yet, that Danielle can talk about more, is that throughout the exhibition in different places, there are opportunities to hear from scientists about what they're doing. And that hits on each of the different elements in the exhibition. And that it could be very easy to just kind of blow through the exhibit and not pick up the speaker and listen to that. But I really recommend that people do that, because that's a way to get the real value out of the exhibit, these perspectives of these people that are absolutely on the front line. And that's what's really fun for me, being at and participating in the activities of a university museum. We're in the middle of this kind of cauldron of all this wonderful research. And this exhibit really taps into such a rich vein of that work and kind of brings it to this venue that can have hundreds of thousands of people come through and get to experience that. So this isn't something that's been highly processed and put together as an entertainment thing. I hope it is entertaining, but it's more like making accessible to people, what does the frontier look like? What are people doing right now to understand the brain? And what does AI mean in that context?
And Danelle, I've seen you nod a bit. Anything else you would like to add to that?
I just want to, okay, so museums, when I think about the Peabody Museum with the dinosaurs and all that stuff, two things come to mind. One of them is, when David asked me to curate this exhibit, I was immediately excited. And one of the reasons was because I have so many of my own memories associated with the museum. So in a way, yes, in a way, the museum, it's not about neuroscience, but in a way it is. It is in multiple ways. We have memories associated with it. We use our brains to navigate a museum. And it's not a stretch. It's actually, the museum in and of itself is a form of memory. It's actually collecting knowledge from hundreds of years, from our past, and trying to stitch it together to create a narrative of what are we, where are we, why are we here, etc. Like, going back to the dinosaurs, like the different societies around the world. So this is very much, as a neuroscientist, this is very much part of our memory, of our human experience. And we wanted to kind of tie that in and have people take a second in the museum through this exhibit and just, reflect about that and reflect about the like how the brains work, how perception works, how are they experienced in the museum, etc. So that's one aspect that I wanted to share. In the area of AI, one of the things that we try to do two main things. One of them is explain how AI works. So a person that's going to the museum will understand what AI is and what it is not. So it's called artificial intelligence, but it's not the same type of intelligence that you and I have. Like, AI is not gonna kind of connect to it connects to a lot of facts and brings them together, but it doesn't create, it doesn't connect to brains the way that our brains connect to other brains. And although it is inspired in neuroscience, so it is knowledge from neuroscience, actually dating back, some of the concepts dating back to the Ramón y Cajal and Golgi concepts that we were talking about in the beginning of the program, were used to derive aspects of the AI that we use today. But the other thing that I find fascinating about AI that we try to get the visitors to reflect on is the fact that, we've been using machines for a long time, and I don't know anybody that feels particularly threatened by the fact that a bulldozer can carry orders of magnitude more weight than a human being, or that a car can go like many times faster than a person can run. No one feels existential crisis about that. And the reason is because those are not faculties that we associate with the human experience. But what AI is doing, which looks like, creating things or creating thoughts or creating, text, those are things that we associate with uniquely human things. But we make the argument that that says more about us than it does about AI. The fact that we feel threatened about AI is more a reflection of how we experience and how we think about the human experience than AI. And then we try to place that into context of other discoveries that have really shaken us up. Like, for example, when scientists discovered that we're not the center of the universe. Like every morning we go out and we see the sun come out on the east and set on the west, and it looks like the sun is going around us, but actually it doesn't. And so this is another one of those revolutions, and it will shake a little bit how we think about our human experience, but that's part of being human, of gaining different perspectives.
Absolutely. And clearly we have so many things to think about after this conversation. And we got about a minute here left, but David would love to ask you for some final thoughts. What do you hope our listeners take away from this conversation today, besides obviously going to visit the exhibit?
Yeah, we'd love to have people come and visit the exhibit, of course. I think I'm very interested to hear what people take away from this. As you mentioned, this is a different kind of exhibition for us. I'm hopeful that so far there's been a really positive response. I hope that continues, because I see this as a step towards tapping into other parts of the university where we can do that. Not to say we're not giving up on dinosaurs. We're not giving up on some of the other exhibitions that your listeners will know about, but adding to that. When we reopened, we, for the first time, opened a gallery on the history of science, and that taps into physics and chemistry and astronomy and microbiology and all kinds of other fields that people don't traditionally associate with our museum. And yet we have collections that can support that. And Danielle and his colleagues did a great job of using the collections in different places throughout the gallery to help tell the story. And that's what's really fun. We constantly get to kind of move on to the next thing, which is can be a little wearying at times,
Sure.
but it's also really exhilarating to be able to think about what's next. And I hope that in this case, people will go to this exhibit and then feel a little more informed about following in coming months and years the developments by people like Danielle, who are really fundamentally changing what we understand about brains and what they can do. And in the case of humans, really understanding ourselves as the AI revolution and everything else keeps going along. These are topics we really all do need to address and really think about to move towards the kind of world we want to be in.
Hey, maybe dinosaur neurology is next, is what I'm thinking. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. You've been listening to David Skelly, who's the director of the Yale Peabody Museum. David, thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure.
You're also listening to Colón Ramos, who's a professor of neuroscience and curated the exhibit that you've been listening to. Danielle, thank you so much for being here with us too. The Mind Over Matter exhibition at the Yale Peabody Museum is officially open to the public. You can find more information about it by checking out our website at ctpublic.org/wherewelive. And coming up, we go from exploring how the brain interprets the brain through art to giving every artist of every ability and disability a chance to create. Give us a call if you have any questions, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. There's so much we don't know about how the brain works, but our next guest says that every artist, no matter their background or ability, deserves a rich creative life. Inspired Arts is a Connecticut-based program working to support artists with disabilities. They provide a platform to give greater purpose, independence, and creative expression to all artists they work with. And joining us now is Rebecca Manloli. She is the Senior Art Program Manager at Inspire Arts. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we'd love to hear the origin story of Inspire Arts. How did it all get started?
Yeah, so the Supported Living Group is a Connecticut provider of non-medical community-based support services. And the executive director, Jamie Arbor, several years ago, established Inspire Arts as its vocational arts program to allow artists with disabilities and including survivors of acquired brain injuries the opportunity to make a living doing what they love with the mission of encouraging creative expression, and securing a greater independence and purpose within the community.
So help us understand their program better, because it sounds like it's going much beyond art therapy, because you're helping these artists become prosperous and really hone their craft and like you mentioned, really being able to continue to do the things that they love.
Yeah, and like you said in the opening, it's like everybody has the right to a creative life, and all those individuals with disabilities should have access to art studios and the means to pursue art as a career. And so we have two locations. There's one in Bethany. We have our location in Avon, and it's a beautiful space that is collaborative. We have fully equipped art studios with the means of allowing them to create with different mediums and explore really what their interests are and lead with their creative agency. If they come in and they want to try something new, we can make that happen. So, and we're unique in that they're working side by side. So they're building friendships with each other, and we're providing this platform so that they can share their work with the community.
And ahead of the show, one of your artists at Inspire Arts, Lorraine Pablo, shared her story. Lorraine had a stroke when she was 23, and before having a stroke, she had actually just been offered a job, and she experiences hemiparalysis and expressive aphasia. So sometimes it takes her a moment to find the right words, and we asked her about what her life looked like before having a stroke and how she found her art.
I was doing good. I had went down, I had gotten the job and everything, and next thing you know, I just had a migraine, and I took some pills thinking, and then I think like the next day I had my stroke. First, I said, well, I couldn't really talk to an extent, but I was like, did we get hit by a car? Or, did I fall off? Anything except for a stroke, because those are for old people. But I didn't know. I had already was like drawing. So, but I just had to learn, and then, and then it was like, okay, let's do something else, like collage or painting or woodworking and whatever. And then as I just got, I won't say better. Well, I will say better, because in my book, but yeah, so I was very, very quiet, and now I talk, so because now I know that there are other people that are in the same boat, and you can come there, and it's just like a family. I just like that it's my art and somebody else can go home with it.
And you can find a link to some of Lorraine's artwork on our website, sctpublic.org/wherewelive. And Rebecca, can you respond to what we heard from Lorraine? It was really nice hearing from her.
Yeah, Lorraine is an incredibly talented, self-taught painter and collage artist. And yes, I highly recommend everyone going to the website because all of our artists work and they all have platforms to show their work, so you can see all their art, their galleries online. But yeah, it's this is art allows for healing in so many ways, and it can reduce stress and provide a tool for communication. So as they create together and like share their work with each other, they're building confidence, and like it just is really wonderful to see. So she's incredible.
And when you think about ways we need to make arts more inclusive, especially with Inspire Arts, it sounds like it's such a family. And you mentioned earlier there's a big community aspect to this, especially when it comes to artists with disabilities in terms of making it more inclusive. What comes to mind for you? What do we need to do better?
Well, I think it's the Connecticut art scene is really allowing more artists with disabilities to share their work. We provide our artists with a platform online. We bring their art into the community and have them participate in large shows and small shows. This provides them further access to the arts market. But sometimes in a situation, I've heard from our survivors that it can be isolating after this experience. So having art as a tool for communication, and it can also like reclaim their sense of identity after experiencing brain injury. So it's like getting their voice out so they could share their personal journeys is so important. And that's what we're doing at Inspire Arts.
Got about 30 seconds here. Any final thoughts you hope to leave with our listeners?
Yes, I would love for everybody to please check our website. And also in January and February, we'll be exhibiting at the Simsbury Public Library. So you can come to the artist reception on January 7th from 5:30 to 7:30, meet our artists, and just support our program. We would love for you to see you there.
Well, thanks for sharing that with us. And a reminder for our listeners that you can find all that information on our website at ctpublic.org/wherewelive. You've been listening to Rebecca Maloney, who's the Senior Art Manager at Inspire Arts, which is a Connecticut program that works to support artists with disabilities. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for sharing your story with us today.
So much for having us.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible, and our technical producer is Gene Armatruda. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app, and thank you all so much for listening.